Chapter 11. The Other Way Out. Down the cliff they scrambled again, down and down towards the river brink. It was a perilous journey, but they achieved it. On some particularly difficult ledges, they had to use each other's tails as mountaineers use ropes. One of them held on tight while the other slid down. Then the one below made a back for the one above, or even caught him as he jumped. Down they went and down, fur scraped, tails aching, and at last stood gasping but triumphant upon the heap of jumbled stone. "What did I tell you?" panted Nils. There was a water gate, all right. Up under a cavernous stone arch, cut stone, rose a flight of granite steps that disappeared into the gloom above, and in the buttress to one side was even an old iron mooring ring. But how well had the river done its work? Were those steps still blocked higher up? Exhausted as they were, the mice had to know. At least it was easier going up than coming down, though the steps would normally have been too high even for tail work. The river, retreating, had washed down ramps of sand and small stones against either wall. Nils and Bernard slipped a bit on wet mud and shreds of waterweed, but otherwise made good progress, and with each step passed felt their hearts lift. It looked as though the whole flight was clear, and so indeed it proved, right up to the top, where a high rusted gate lolled, half fallen from its hinges. Even a man could squeeze by. Bernard and Nils, of course, simply ran between the bars. Where were they now? "We're still pretty deep down in the castle," said Bernard. "Aye, at dungeon level," said Nils. Before them stretched a long, narrow passage cut from the rock itself. For a moment they thought it was the corridor where the jailer with the food pans came to let down the prisoners' food. But there were no grids in its floor. The floor was solid rock too. Nils and Bernard ran up and down twice to make sure. So was one wall solid rock, but in the other was a row of iron doors. Dungeon doors. "And there's another door, don't you see, at the end?" cried Nils, "to bring the prisoners in by." At last it was clear, what the mice had never been able to discover, how the prisoners were got into their cells. Small wonder, too, that the jailers weren't aware of the river's work until a new prisoner arrived. They had no reason to enter this corridor at all. And as if to confirm all speculation, at that very moment sounded a jailer's boots stamping overhead, accompanied by the clank of food pans. Nils and Bernard, by listening intently, could hear the grids creak up, one after the other, behind and above each iron door. "All we need now," said Nils, "is the key. I see it all," he exclaimed excitedly. "We get hold of the key, drop it through the grid, jump down ourselves, and all escape together by the water gate. All we need now is the right key." In Bernard's opinion, this splendid plan had still a lot of loose ends. How were they to get the key? But he refrained from saying so. Indeed, it touched him to the heart to see Nils now run from sill to sill, attempting in vain to call beneath some Norwegian word of hope. The doors were set in solid rock. No voice of mouse could possibly penetrate. "Come on back, old fellow," urged Bernard, not unsympathetically, just practically. "Now is the time, if there ever was one, for proper planning. Come on back to Miss Bianca and let's think." It was a desperate, perilous journey again. First down the steps to the water gate, then up and up the cliff, and up again over the castle walls. Again the dauntless mice achieved it. Bernard was as dauntless as Sir John Hunt, and Nils as Sir Edmund Hillary. The thought of all they had to tell Miss Bianca spurred them on, and though they ached in every limb, they never paused once until they reached the little boss of rock from which they had first peered down. There they allowed themselves a brief rest while they got their breath, and also discussed whether to have a breakfast first and lunch immediately afterwards, or lunch straight away. Then off they set again. They had still a long way to go, but as Bernard said, the worst was over. He was wrong. Fatigue made them careless. When at last they regained the door of the head jailer's sitting room, they hurried straight in without stopping to reconnoiter, and at that crucial moment, for the first time, met Mamluk face to face. Mamluk was as surprised as they were, but he wasn't tired. For just one instant, they all three stood transfixed, Bernard and Nils foolishly huddled together. Then out flashed a cruel black paw and pinned them both to the ground. 2. At the same moment, Miss Bianca peeped out of the hole. She had been worrying all morning, ever since Bernard and Nils weren't there for breakfast. As the hours passed, her anxiety grew. All morning she had been running to the door to look for their return. Now, at the sight that met her eyes, she almost fainted. But she had got out of the habit of fainting, and instead uttered but one piercing shriek of dismay. Mamluk looked around. He grinned with pleasure. From his point of view, the appearance of Miss Bianca was the one thing needed to make the fun complete. So, these are your unsociable friends, he purred. Now I shall have sport indeed. Would you like to see me eat them up? The three mice exchanged agonized glances. Whatever you do, lie still, adjured the glance of Miss Bianca. What Nils and Bernard had to convey was far more complicated. Each longed with all his might, before he died, to pass on to Miss Bianca all their discoveries about the river and the water gate and the dungeon doors. It was obviously impossible. She saw only that they had something to convey, and of terrific importance. Ha 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 ha! Laughed Mamluk. Come closer, little lady, and watch. He began to shake all over with cruel glee. Nils and Bernard could feel it oozing from his very toes. His grin stretched from ear to ear, revealing every one of his dreadfully sharp teeth, and even the wide red gullet behind. Tears of mirth rolled down his whiskers and glistened in his fur like the spangles of a demon king. Miss Bianca had never seen him so terrible as in this fiendish merriment. But she stepped bravely out towards him, summoning all her funds of wit and resourcefulness and feminine cunning. Which will you eat first? Inquired she. You can't swallow both at once, you know. Oh, can't I? Grinned Mamluk. You just watch me. I meant without spoiling your appetite for the midnight feast, explained Miss Bianca hastily. It is tonight, isn't it? She added. The great feast when you eat more than anyone else, and everyone is so astonished at you. Dear me, they'll be astonished in a different way if you're so full of Nils and Bernard you can't manage a bite, said Miss Bianca carelessly. She was being very clever, both in disguising her true feelings and in thus playing on Mamluk's vanity. It wouldn't be half so much fun for him to eat her friends before her eyes if she didn't seem to care about them, while his reputation as Mamluk the Iron-Thumbed was his greatest pride. He looked uneasily at the mice under his paw. After their mouths, after their months of good living, both Nils and Bernard had put on weight. Either one would have made a square cat meal, and in point of fact, Mamluk was accustomed to eat nothing whatever all that day. Perhaps you're right, he admitted. I'll just break their necks and have 'em tomorrow." "Dear me," said Miss Bianca again. "I thought you considered yourself quite a gourmet. My Persian friend, whom I may have mentioned to you, always told me mice shouldn't be hung even an hour. But I suppose you're forced to live coarsely." Mamluk was stung. "I don't live coarsely," he shouted. "I live on the fat of the land." "It's so nice to hear you take that view," said Miss Bianca blandly. "It shows a truly humble nature. My Persian friend now—" "Nor's my nature humble," shouted Mamluk. "My Persian friend," continued Miss Bianca, "had quite a little witticism on the subject. 'Fresh killed mouse, caviar,' he used to say. 'One day old, ants' eggs.' Of course, if you don't mind eating ants' eggs, which at the embassy we fed to goldfish, I've really no advice to give. And," said Miss Bianca kindly, "you must do just as you think best." Mamluk was by now thoroughly confused. He didn't want to spoil his appetite for the feast. He didn't want to let Nils and Bernard go. And Miss Bianca had somehow made it seem that if he killed and saved them up, he would be regarded as a goldfish. For a cat with two plump mice under his paw, the situation was really extraordinary. The uncertainty in his mind began to transfer itself to his muscles. Very slightly, the grip of his paw slackened. Bernard and Nils looked at each other, hardly daring to hope. "Or if I might make a suggestion," added Miss Bianca impulsively, "do, as you're dining out, pay a little attention to your coat. You might begin with your back." "What's wrong with my back?" growled Mamluk, confused afresh by this sudden change of subject. "Just look," said Miss Bianca. Vain Mamluk looked. Actually, there was nothing wrong with his back coat at all. He'd groomed himself rather specially, but he couldn't help looking. Over his shoulder, away from the mice. "Now!" shrieked Miss Bianca. With one instant's terrific effort, Nils and Bernard wrenched themselves free and streaked like lightning for the hole. Miss Bianca skimmed in just ahead of them, and Mamluk was left outside, fuming. Three. Lunch was sausage and sauté potatoes, followed by treacle sponge, followed by cheese and biscuits. Nils and Bernard decided to cut breakfast after all and just have twice as much of everything. With so much to tell Miss Bianca, they had to talk with their mouths full. She, for her part, was alternately so enthralled by their discoveries and so alarmed at the dangers they had run, she could barely nibble a crumb. "What heroism and enterprise!" she murmured. "Dear Bernard, dear Nils, how warmly I congratulate you." "It is you who are the heroine," said Bernard soberly. "Without your wonderful coolness and resource, we should neither of us be here now." "That's right," agreed Nils. "We'd be in Mamluk's famous tum." Miss Bianca shuddered. "Pray don't speak of it," she begged, "or I really shall faint. Indeed," she added gravely, "we must now have no more thoughts of ourselves or of anything else until the prisoner is free. It is positively New Year's Day tomorrow, and how much still remains to be decided. How many obstacles loom still in our way. Oh dear!" Suddenly, uncontrollably wept Miss Bianca, a prey to delayed nervous shock, and no wonder. "That dreadful, dreadful river!" For a moment they all of them thought about the river. "There, we'll have to swim for it," said Nils heartily. "It's the barrens on the other side," he added, "that bother me." For a moment They all thought about the barons. "There, we'll have to march for it," said Bernard. Then they all thought about the prisoner, and their courage was renewed. They began to plan in detail what had never been planned before, or if planned, had never succeeded: the liberation of a prisoner from the Black Castle. Chapter 12: The Great Enterprise. It was determined, in the first place, to act on New Year's Day, tomorrow. This really went without saying. New Year's morning, with the jailer on duty, also Mamluk, two bilists to be efficient, offered the mice their one and only chance of entering the corridor above the dungeons. "Or may we not assume it a certainty?" proposed Miss Bianca. "Seconded," said Bernard. For such a momentous discussion they were having an extra, special meeting of the Prisoners' Aid Society, Black Castle branch. They just cleared lunch away first. "Call it a certainty," said Nils. "Carried unanimously," said Miss Bianca from the chair. "We all three, then," she proceeded, "enter the corridor." "Question," said Bernard. "I suggest Madam Chairwoman join us below at the water gate, thus bypassing at least some of the peril." "I certainly won't," cried Miss Bianca. "To venture alone down to a river," she added more formally, "without other members to assist and guide, is something no chairwoman should be asked even to contemplate. We all enter the corridor together. Nils then makes contact with the prisoner." "Trust me for that," shouted Nils. "I'm sure we do," said Miss Bianca. "Nils next through the grid, throws down the right key." She paused. "How do we get the right key?" asked Miss Bianca. "The jailer will have it on his belt," said Nils, "along with all the rest. Bernard and I have seen him. I throw down the whole bunch, and the prisoner will sort out which is his." "But how do we get the keys from the jailer?" persisted Miss Bianca. "By force," said Nils. Miss Bianca had an uneasy feeling that the point wasn't really settled. How exactly did one use force on a jailer if one happened to be a mouse? But she didn't want to undermine the meeting's confidence. Also, she recalled a saying of the great Duke of Wellington's to the effect that, whereas his enemies made plans of wire, he made his of string. That is, he always left something to the inspiration of the moment. Frail and pliable as string, yet in the end strong as a rope ladder. Miss Bianca trusted their plans might prove, and passed on to the next step. "Thank you, Nils," she said, "for your excellent idea. You then jump down yourself. Oh dear," added Miss Bianca, now losing a trifle of her own confidence. "How do I get down?" Nils and Bernard went into committee for a moment. "I will jump second," reported Bernard, when they came out. "And between us we will stretch my handkerchief like a fireman. Then you jump onto it. It won't be half so dangerous as saving us from Mamluk." "I suppose I can," murmured Miss Bianca, and returned to her role as Madam Chairwoman. "Next, we induce the prisoner to place his confidence in us." "Trust me for that too," shouted Nils. "And conduct him, he having unlocked his cell with the key provided, to the river bank. There have been far too many interruptions from the floor," added Miss Chairwoman Miss Bianca severely, "and I don't want to hear anyone say, 'Then we'll have to swim for it.' The meeting knows it will have to swim for it." "And then march for it," muttered Bernard. "And then march for it, agreed," agreed Miss Bianca. She ought really to have called Bernard to order too, but somehow she didn't. "It thus appears," she continued, that until the jailer goes his round tomorrow morning, there is nothing we can usefully do. Our best course is to get as much sleep as possible in order to recruit our strength, though I must say I should like to leave things tidy. In fact, after sleeping all the rest of the day, while Mamluk watched fruitlessly outside, they spring cleaned half the night. There was no real reason for it. Probably no mouse would ever take that hole again. Yet Miss Bianca's instinct was right, too. There is nothing like housework for calming the nerves. Mamluk went off to the party shortly before 12, so they could put all the furniture outside. Then for hours all was peaceful domestic activity. Faintly, as Nils and Bernard took the carpet up, they heard the songs and shouts of the jailer's midnight feast. Faintly, as Bernard and Nils cleaned the wallpaper with dry breadcrumbs, they heard a last burst of merriment die away. As dawn broke, Miss Bianca, sweeping out a last pan of rubbish through the lobby, saw Mamluk, the iron-tumbed, totter back and collapse before the hearth, by which time the nerves of all three mice were as calm as could be. It was pleasant, too, as after a sustaining breakfast they took a last look round to see everything so neat and clean. "It wasn't such a bad hole after all," admitted Nils, as he got into his sea boots and buckled on his cutlass. Cudgel in hand, Bernard nodded silently. He couldn't trust himself to speak. In spite of all the terrible circumstances, the hours he spent hanging wallpaper for Miss Bianca had been among the happiest of his life. He was glad to hear her give the hole a kind word too. "Adieu, dear hole," murmured Miss Bianca softly. "Dear hole, adieu." Bernard picked up her valise. Nils looked out first to see if the coast was clear. It was. Beside the stove, Mamluk still snored and tossed in queasy dreams. For the last time they picked their way among the cigar butts and the matchboxes and the chewing gum wrappers. Miss Bianca cast a last compassionate glance towards the poor butterflies on the walls, but they were none of them sorry to see the last of the head jailer's sitting room. 2. Along the corridor they hurried, down some stairs, along a corridor, and down more stairs again. It was all strange territory to Miss Bianca, but Nils and Bernard, after their explorations, ran on unhesitatingly. Not a soul besides themselves was about. Empty stretched the corridors, unguarded the stairs. All jailers, save one, as Mamluk had foretold, lay still abed, quite unable to lift head from pillow. But where was that one? As the mice approached the corridor above the dungeons, they began to take more care. At the last flight of steps, Nils crept on in advance, while Bernard and Miss Bianca waited halfway down. "I hope he won't be long," whispered Miss Bianca, for now that even their own footsteps were stilled, the silence was frightening. The whole weight of the castle seemed to press down on them like an enormous, million times magnified paw. Then back Nils called in triumph. They hurried after and beheld inert against an iron door, holding it open like a doorstop, the jailer with the food pans. He had got just so far before collapsing. The pans and their contents lay scattered all about. To Miss Bianca's extreme relief, there was obviously no need to use force on him, for he was sound asleep. What a moment that should have been! What a half moment indeed it was! But scarcely had the mice savored their triumph when they perceived something they hadn't bargained for. There was no bunch of keys at the fat jailer's belt. The key ring dangled far out of reach overhead, where he had left it in the lock of the smooth iron door. No mouse can run up smooth iron. "Now what do we do?" muttered Nils desperately. Think, said Bernard. We can't be beaten now. Enormous above them, like a mountain, loomed the bulk of the big, fat jailer. Like a mountain. Bernard had been mountaineering with Nils half the previous day, and the top of the jailer's head lolled only an inch below the lock. Stand ready to catch, cried Bernard recklessly. The Duke of Wellington would have been proud of him, as Bernard now acted on the inspiration of the moment. So was Miss Bianca proud of him, as Bernard, without the slightest hesitation, leaped up onto the jailer's outstretched foot and ran up his leg and then across his big heaving stomach. It heaved like an earthquake and then up onto his shoulder. Oh, pray take care, called Miss Bianca, almost too far below to be heard. Bernard waved back and mountaineered on. Across the jailer's face was a traverse to dismay the most expert. Where beard stubble gave place to bare flesh, it was like traversing polished rock. Bernard only just managed it, and only just in time. The mountain turned volcano as the jailer sneezed. But Bernard, his foot at the roots of bushy hair, had plenty to hang on to. The jailer sneezed, but in his sleep. Courageous Bernard plunged ever on, now as through a greasy jungle. He attained the jailer's very scalp, and thence, with a supreme effort, launched himself at the dangling keys above. Twice and thrice he swung his full weight from them. Then out they came from the lock, and he and keyring together cascaded jangling down. Over to you, Nils, gasped Bernard. Nils instantly ran on. There was no time now for praise or congratulations. Bernard and Miss Bianca followed, dragging the keys between them. Beyond the comatose jailer stretched the dungeon corridor itself, with, set in its floor, at intervals of 2 or 3 yards, the gratings over the dungeons. Nils ran swiftly from one to the next, calling through each a word of Norwegian. The suspense was almost unbearable, for suppose the jailer should really wake. An age seemed to pass before, at the very last, Nils halted. Had someone answered? Evidently, yes. The keys, cried Nils. Between them, they pushed the keys through the bars, easing them side by side on the ring, then eased the ring through too, and heard it fall below. Norway forever, cried Nils, and unhesitatingly launched himself after. So did Bernard. Miss Bianca, peering down, in a matter of seconds, saw his handkerchief stretched to receive her. Fortunately, it was a very large handkerchief, more like a young tablecloth. But even so, she had to shut her eyes before she could nerve herself to follow. Indeed, only a joint cry of, Be brave, Miss Bianca, gave her the necessary impetus. But it did. She shut her eyes and jumped. A moment later, they were all three together in the Norwegian prisoner poet's dungeon. The first stage of the unachievable had been achieved. 3. But poor prisoner, poor poet. It was difficult at first to tell whether he was old or young. He looked so thin and ill and shaggy, the hair that streamed in elf locks over the rags of a prison uniform. Was it fair or white? Were those eyelids red with age or with weeping? Huddled on the edge of his bunk, he might have been 20 years old or 100. Only something in the way he huddled, elbows on knees, chin on fists, reminded Miss Bianca of the way the boy used to huddle, if ever the boy was terribly, terribly unhappy. Oh, he's young, she whispered. Poor, poor prisoner. What spoke most eloquently of his despair was that the bunch of keys lay still where it fell, on the ground beside his bed. He hadn't even stretched out a hand to see what it was. Or perhaps things had been thrown down at him before, in jailerish sports, just as Mamluk sportively jumped down to spit at him. For a moment the mice could only gaze in pity, while the eyes of Miss Bianca at least filled with tears. Then Nils again said something in Norwegian. "Be still, my poor brain," muttered the prisoner. "Is not one such delusion enough?" In fact, Nils had to repeat himself, shouting about 4 times, before the prisoner looked wonderingly up. First up, then around. Nils was almost hoarse before the prisoner looked down. As soon as they had his attention, the 3 mice lined up, and Nils and Bernard took 2 steps back, then one forward, and politely pulled their whiskers. There is nothing like sticking to manners in any unusual situation. Miss Bianca in the middle bowed. After only the slightest pause to get his legs properly under him, the prisoner rose and bowed back. It must be remembered that he was a poet. It is the gift of all poets to find the commonplace astonishing, and the astonishing quite natural. The sight of Bernard and Nils and Miss Bianca, Nils in his sea boots, Bernard carrying a valise, and Miss Bianca wearing a silver chain, therefore didn't disconcert him in the least, and when Nils again addressed him in Norwegian, he was far more delighted than surprised. Yet how feeble his own poor voice after the long silence of solitary confinement, as he courteously bade them welcome. Miss Bianca again felt her eyes prick with tears. "Tell him we are come to save him," she prompted. "That's what I'm trying to," said Nils rather impatiently. "But here goes again." He launched into quite a long speech, interrupted from time to time by questions from the prisoner. "He just wants to ask after his relations," translated Nils more impatiently than ever. "Tell him there'll be opportunities for that later," urged Bernard. "Tell him that just now we've got to hurry." By this time the prisoner, partly through weakness, partly to see his visitors better, had sunk down to his knees. Nils jumped onto his hand and ran up his arm and began to shout directly in his ear. "I'm having to tell him all about the Prisoners' Aid Society," Nils called down irritably. Again an age seemed to pass before the prisoner's expression turned from dreamy pleasure to as much as ordinary attention. But at last he began to understand, and his eyes grew brighter and brighter. He picked up the keys and cradled them lovingly in his palm, bending on Bernard such a look of admiration that modest Bernard blushed, and at last, with a few brief words, rose shakily to his feet. "What does he say now?" asked Bernard. "Will he come with us?" "He says," translated Nils soberly, "that he puts his life in our hands." The 3 mice looked at each other. They looked at the prisoner's gaunt, feeble frame, and Nils and Bernard thought of the slippery steps down to the water gate and of the angry river beyond. What a responsibility! But their courage was high, and so it seemed was the prisoner's. He was a poet. He didn't think he was dreaming, as a prisoner who wasn't a poet might have done, and so missed his chance of escape. Shakily but resolutely, his fingers trembling but his spirit firm, he tried one key after the other in the lock of his door. At the third it opened. There is no more wonderful moment in life than when a prison door opens. It was not through weakness that the prisoner, for a moment, again sank to his knees. Then up he rose, only once shuddered as the cold damp air whistled through his rags, followed the mice along the passage, and with a smile set his foot on the topmost of the water gate steps. 4. The river had lapped back. Yet even as they descended, the roar of the water sounded louder and louder in their ears. The river was angry still, but there was no help for it. They had to go on. Each step seemed a separate precipice, slippery with washed-up mud. The mice skidded and slipped. The prisoner had to brace himself for support against the wet, rough, rocky wall. In fear and trembling, yet all resolute, they descended. In fear and trembling, they reached the bottom. And there, wonder of wonders, beheld a raft hugging the bank for shelter, tied to the old iron ring in the old, newly revealed Watergate wall. "The luck of the mice!" cried Bernard. "The luck of the mice at last! Nils, tell the prisoner to get on board. You, Miss Bianca, run along the rope, and Nils and I will follow." Nils said something in Norwegian. The prisoner nodded. He was at the very last step. Only a yard separated him from the raft. Then that foot slipped. In he fell. A powerful undertow sucked him down, and the faithless river carried him away.